Good evening and welcome to MADIA's third virtual meetup since COVID began. I hope everyone is safe and well. I'm Bruce Lathrop. I'm a member of MADIA board and I will be introducing the presenter. But first I wanted to thank Brenda Trainer, Jeanette DePatti, and Brian Quant for their help with this meeting. Brenda will be moderating the chat discussion. Jeanette will be taking live questions and Brian will be helping out with technical details. Before we start the presentation, I wanted to tell you a little bit about MADIA. MADIA is a nonprofit 501c3 educational organization whose mission is to help the scientific, industrial, and technical workforce with programs such as this on entrepreneurship, business, finance, and operations, and technology development and commercialization, all within settings which encourage networking and collaboration. I will go ahead and introduce the presenter, who is Dan Broderick. He is the manager of the Office of Technology at JPL. Prior to JPL, he was the associate director at Caltech. And before that, he was the director of the Office of Technology Transfer and Commercialization at the University of Michigan College of Engineering. He's worked as an electrical engineer at Motorola and as a manager of electrical engineering at Rockwell. And he's also been involved in several startups. Dan received his Bachelor of Science in Engineering at the University of Michigan, his master's degree in electrical engineering and computer science at Northwestern, and finally his MBA at the University of Chicago. So without further ado, please welcome Dan.
Okey-doke. Okay, so you should see the presentation. Does that look okay, Bruce?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So the Vital Ventilator VITAL stands for Ventilation Intervention Technology Available Locally. It was a ventilator that was developed at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And it's an interesting case because this was, as opposed to a lot of other ventilators that were demonstration projects, or educational projects, or publicity, we're actually licensing this worldwide. And right now we have 27 licensees all over the world that are interested in using this and developing it and commercializing it. And I'd like to go over the timeline a little bit. This ventilator project was conceived around March 11th with David Van Buren and JPL Chief Engineer Robert Manning over some coffee at the coffee cart. This is before the COVID-19 shutdown. And they were wondering, how can we help reduce the ventilator shortage that could be coming? And fortunately in California it wasn't too bad, but worldwide there were some severe shortages of ventilators. And given the amount of engineering talent at JPL, almost 3,000 engineers at JPL, they really thought that, if we put a really good team together, we could do something about it. So on March 16th, they put a small team and held a meeting in left field. And as you can imagine, at JPL, they do a lot of brainstorming because we have to live by our wits. We're a contractor. We're actually a NASA Space Center, but we have to asked NASA for funds to do projects. So of course, one of those projects was the Mars Curiosity rover, and now the Endeavour rover. And on the InSight, but people have to really brainstorm these projects and make sure that we're serving the public good by getting the greatest amount of science and technology available through these missions at a reasonable cost. And so brainstorming is a very everybody knows about it. There's a lot of people that are really good at it. And we're also pretty good at putting together tiger teams, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the idea was to put a inexpensive, compact pre-ICU ventilator. You can use these in the ICU as well, but you don't have to. And this appeared to be particularly valuable given the situation. We'll go into that a little bit further. And then this concept of the tiger team approach was discussed as well. And JPL uses tiger teams to really take a small group of talented cooperative engineers and drive and really do a good proof of concept for typically missions, typically space missions. So the group grew to about 50 JPL engineers who had experience in fluid dynamics, robotics, electronics, and medical devices. NASA provided some funds and laboratory space at JPL. These funds came in the form of discretionary funds that Caltech was able to use for various reasons, and NASA approved. And the goal was to produce a real working ventilator with FDA approval that was to be commercialized and utilized by people, as opposed to an educational, public relations, or demonstration projects, which there are a lot of. And I'm not belittling that. I think these are all really good efforts, and you probably heard a lot about these efforts. But our goal was to actually get something out there in the real world. And so we utilized outside doctors. The FDA, we had a conduit to the FDA that provided fantastic insight. If you're developing a medical device, if you actually have somebody at the FDA on your team that's giving you advice and direction, it really helps so that you can get that FDA approval or clearance. It's just hugely valuable. We also worked with hospitals, medical schools, including Dr. Matthew Levin at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, and Dr. Tisha Wang, who's a pulmonologist and critical care physician at UCLA. So the Tiger team, probably wondering what that means. Basically at JPL, a lot of times when we really want to explore a concept and see if it really works in the real world, we put together a very lean team, very skilled, highly cooperative, with clear goals and in a very positive, supporting environment. The idea is to just get from point A to point B as quickly as you can, and to just cooperate as much as you can. And then also they're given the highest priority and very quick approvals when needed. And I can tell you at JPL and NASA, there is a big bureaucracy, so these quick approvals are just key to really getting things done quickly. And so on April 21st, things did happen very quickly. We successfully passed critical tests at the Mount Sinai Icahn School of Medicine in New York, obtained FDA emergency authorization April 22nd. That wasn't too long before the concept started. And I put out a notice of licensing opportunity to over 100 companies, and we published it on our website. And we put together very quickly a public-facing website that went live, and that could include registrants that were interested in the device and learning more about it. And it was amazing how fast this website was put together as well. So I was, watching that happen, and the people and the interplay and the overall intelligence was just an amazing thing to watch. So on April 30th, the FDA granted an EUA for their pneumatic design, which is the pneumatic design is something to be used in a hospital. We'll talk about the difference between a pneumatic and compressor design, but it's when you have an oxygen line and a air line, and you can mix the oxygen and air together. And you don't need to pressurize the air because it's already pressurized in the hospital. On May 19th, we signed the first license. It was with a local company here, Prodex, in Irvine, California, a small public company. By May 29th, only 10 days later, we had 8 US licensees, and we announced those. And on June 1st, the FDA granted an EUA, emergency use authorization, for the compressor design. And I just wanted to mention, just watching this and observing it, it is just absolutely remarkable how fast things get done when really good people cooperate and are given high priority. And it was just an extraordinary thing to watch. So I did talk about the compressor versus the pneumatic designs. So in a ventilator, the oxygen and air are typically mixed together in the ventilator. In the pneumatic design, it's typically used in a hospital setting. The air and oxygen lines are pressurized and are attached to a wall gas outlet, kind of like an electrical outlet, except for it has gases. And there's no need to filter and pressurize the air, although depressurization might be necessary. And in the compressor design, this is different. This is for use in an environment where pressurized air is not available. You have to take it from the atmosphere. So this is to be used in tents and ambulances, makeshift hospitals, clinical settings. The ventilator has to filter and pressurize the outside air for use in the ventilator. And this adds a much higher level of complexity. And so both designs contain about 1/7 of the parts of a traditional ventilator. And both can deliver high pressure oxygen flows needed for COVID-19 patients while keeping the lungs inflated as they exhale. Let's see, for some reason. Okay, oh, here we go. So I'm going to go into the website for just for a moment. So the first thing I'll do, I'll go into. Can everybody see the brochure that I'm now showing my screen with?
Yes.
Good. So this talks about, this is an actual brochure for the ventilator. Obviously JPL does not manufacture ventilators or maintain them or provide qualifications or training. So we're relying on industry partners to do this for us. And so these are our licensees. So this is very important. I mentioned, why this particular ventilator is especially useful in this particular design. So look at the vital device applicability on this graph. So, you have people that are asymptomatic, mild symptoms, home quarantine and hospitalized. And then you have people that require a full-featured ventilator that has a lot more bells and whistles than this particular ventilator. But most patients require, for COVID-19, require something simpler. They don't need the full-featured ventilator. And when there's a shortage of ventilators, it's probably optimal to use something that is applicable to COVID-19 patients in this stage of the disease, but you don't need something that's quite as fancy and expensive and is only found in ICUs for the most critical patients. So this is where we were really targeting the device. And so it's used for patients that are unable to maintain adequate and safe oxygen levels, variety of clinical states, low compliance, high resistance, hypoxia, too little oxygen, hypercapnia, too little or too much carbon dioxide. And the environment, which is really nice, can be a healthcare facility or a tent or an ambulance or a makeshift hospital using the compressor design. We do need, and we are able to transport patients while it's in operation, provided you use an uninterruptible power supply. And the operator is of course, a trained healthcare professional. This is not for home use for, by relatives and that kind of thing. It is an invasive device. So the intended patient is an acutely ill patient. And typically these are the conditions that they're looking for: low compliance, high resistance, hypoxia, and hypercapnia. And so here's the picture of the device. It has four main capabilities. One is the supplemental oxygen, of course. The other is positive end expiratory pressure. And this maintains the patient's airway pressure above the atmospheric level by exerting pressure that opposes passive emptying of the lung. And this is useful in patients that have reduced lung performance. And then the backup rate and a tidal volume. Tidal volume is the amount of air that goes into your lungs. And the environment is very versatile. So the idea is that it can be handle dirt and dust in a field setting, so an emergency use environment. And we wanted relatively benign temperature and water exposure. And one thing that is nice about the device as well is that this is an intubated device, meaning you're putting a tube down a patient's trachea and then attaching the ventilator to it. So it's invasive. One nice thing is that you can leave the intubation tube in the patient and then change it to a different ventilator if need be, which is very important because when you change that tube, all kinds of things can happen to both the patient and the outside environment. And as I mentioned, the intended operator is really a trained healthcare professional, as all invasive ventilators are. Now, one of the things about this device is that the intended operational life is lower than you would find in a full-fledged ventilator. Again, this has 1/7 of the parts. It's much less expensive, much more compact. The continuous operational lifetime is 20 days, and then the total operational lifetime prior to disposal is 4 months. Now, this is for this emergency use. Of course, if you're a licensee, you can increase both of these values by adding different components and doing different testings and burn-ins and get additional approvals and clearances by the FDA. And so the developmental strategy, as I mentioned, it was a Tiger Team rapid prototyping, of course, partnering with industry and working with the FDA from the initiation, which was really critical to getting people to adopt this and getting people to commercialize it. Obviously, designing for manufacturing, which is just tremendously important. And the supply chain simplicity was also very important because we didn't want to use up parts that are in the traditional ventilator supply chain because we didn't want to cause shortages of existing ventilators. We wanted this to act independently of that. And then, of course, designing for scalability, because whoever the licensee is, they may have to scale from 100 units a month to 10,000 units a month if they really have to. And and really minimal expected training of end users. Certainly less training than a traditional ventilator. And so, as I mentioned, we minimize the number of mechanical and electrical components, and of course, avoid using components that are critical to the production of full-featured ventilators. We don't want to interrupt the supply chain. And this last point is kind of interesting. We wanted to exclude patient exhalation gases from the circuit to avoid a device sterilization cycle time prior to use by the next patient. That was something that the FDA wanted. They didn't want to have this device sterilization cycle, and it makes for a real problem when adopting the ventilator. So this is a picture from the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and this was a picture taken, I believe, the day before the FDA granted its emergency use authorization, which was, really, just a great day. I also wanted to talk about the actual timeline of the registration and the licensees. We had 331 registered companies. And these are actual companies that registered for it from six continents in 42 countries. And we were surprised initially surprised, in hindsight is 2020, but initially surprised at the amount of international interest that we had on this. And you can see from the pie chart, about half were North American companies and about half were foreign companies. Now, it turns out that even though half of the registrants were American companies, we're going to see that, and we had 96 proposals, most of the proposals came from foreign companies. And we had 17 technical reviewers, and the review panel was very interesting. We wanted people that understood about medical devices, had some technical background, and also people that might have had industry experience in terms of actually, manufacturing things and medical devices. And we also wanted people, because there were so many international licensees, people that wanted a license, we wanted people from different countries on that panel that understood the language, in case, because we wanted to interview the licensees before we actually licensed them to really find out what they were made of. And there were so many different countries. We wanted somebody that actually knew the language in case we were interviewing them, and they just really needed somebody that understood the language to communicate effectively what they were trying to say. And so we had several people that spoke foreign languages for that purpose. And we ended up, we now have 27 licensees. They're all, of course, non-exclusive licenses, and they're from 6 continents. 9 of these are United States companies, 18 are international companies. So we have twice as many international companies as US companies, which came as a bit of a surprise. And here we can see, the first we'll show the US companies. All these are small companies except for one large company. And and then we see the international companies from Armenia is actually Western Asia, Australia, several from Brazil, Canada, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, Nigeria now, Portugal, Turkey, and the UAE. So we were very, very pleased at the international outreach, which was really quite interesting and not necessarily expected. So I just wanted to talk briefly. What did these licenses look like? What was it like to be a licensee? We're licensing the technology. We're licensing obviously patent applications. And as people who might be familiar with licensing, sometimes that's all you license is a patent application. But in this case, we really wanted people to be able to design, manufacture, and commercialize the device as soon as possible. So we licensed the patent applications, software, and a whole bunch of technical information that they had access to on a website, on a technical portion of the website. The license ends on the final day of the World Health Organization's Public Health Emergency of International Concern is in effect, or October 1st, 2024. Now, the emergency use authorization issued by the FDA ends on Romanet 1, the WHO's public health emergency concern. So it's good until then. And even though the license was free, we did not want non-performing licenses. We did include developmental and commercialization diligence, general diligence. Oftentimes we include commercial sale milestone or developmental or commercial sale milestone dates in licenses. In this case, we didn't, because if you negotiated licenses, you realize that this is a negotiation. What day are you actually going to come up with an alpha prototype, a beta prototype, a first commercial sale, et cetera. So that would be a specific negotiation for each licensee. If you're licensing 27 licensees, that just isn't feasible. So we didn't put that in, although we did put in quarterly reporting of development and sales. And I think this worked out very well because, as we'll talk about later, some of these companies are just moving ahead very quickly. They're trying to get proposals and achieve contracts from one company in Brazil is looking for a very big contract with Brazil. They're moving ahead very rapidly to achieve the equivalent of the FDA approval in Brazil, and they're really doing a deep dive into the technology and making sure that they can design it and manufacture it as quickly as possible. So the licenses permitted access. How did they get all this technology? So they signed an NDA, and they received access to a secure password-protected website. So this website included very detailed information on parts, fabrication, and assembly, bill of materials, assembly, and operational videos, downloadable computer-aided design drawings, and computer-aided engineering that the licensees could input into their system. So you could just actually download that into your systems. At JPL, we use SolidWorks, but oftentimes you can port these into different CAD and CAE programs. We also included 3D and augmented reality computer-aided design and computer-aided engineering renderings. This was from our Protospace group that did the augmented reality version of the Mars rovers. And it's just a tremendously talented group there. We also provided sourcing for parts so they can know where to get these parts, operating instructions, FDA documents, and also some limited technical support. And right now, we've got about a half a dozen companies that are really taking advantage of that limited technical support because they just really need to get moving as quickly as possible, especially in countries like Brazil and in India, where the crisis is really extreme. So if you're familiar with licensing, especially of medical devices, in an unusual twist, the licensee included certain requirements that the FDA wanted. The FDA emergency use authorization given to a JPL needs to be transferred to licensees because JPL is not going to make these devices, where the licensees need to make these devices. So we actually included certain requirements that the FDA required. One was that it perform validation and testing so that no undue chemicals are generated by the licensed products, ensure that licensed products could contain bacterial filters in the gas pathway, especially for the compressor design, where you don't have a, excuse me, a hospital gas line. And then condition the air to minimize the transfer of particles and volatile organic compounds, and monitoring carbon dioxide, and also the software, ensuring that the software develops prevents multiple consecutive patient-initiated breaths. Oops, let's see, oops, I went backwards. Now this is probably one of the best parts, is that the licensees also have access to prototypes, which is fantastic when you're developing a product. It's really good to have that, that prototype that you have a reference point to. And so we developed 5 prototypes each of the pneumatic and compressor designs, and they're available to licensees for 1-week periods. I think it's up to 6 prototypes now, which is really great. And then there, whenever you do something like this, there's always lessons learned and surprises. For the first bullet, this wasn't a surprise to me, but it was a surprise to a lot of people. There were expectations that large US medical device manufacturers would be licensees. So people were thinking Medtronic is going to be a licensee, J&J, GE, Abbott. So it turns out that none of these companies were really interested, even though Caltech really had research or other partnerships with these companies, because these companies are either recruiting at Caltech, or they're doing research partnerships at Caltech or JPL. And so we did initiate communications with these companies, but none of them even submitted a proposal. And that's not too surprising to people that do university licensing. There's a lot of reasons why large companies would, for large, I've been in a couple large companies. Large companies typically focus on product line extensions and trying to sell existing products. And if they're looking for a very new product that is, kind of revolutionary, they'll buy the company. The food chain in the United States is such that it's really the small companies and that develop the really innovative stuff. They get bought by medium companies, and medium-sized companies get bought by large companies. And so it really wasn't too surprising. Also, there were expectations that this is kind of interesting, that large European medical manufacturers would be licensees, particularly from countries like Germany, France, UK, which is where a lot of medical devices come out of. Same thing, Caltech and JPL had partnerships with these companies, and we initiated communications, but the only proposal from Europe was from a small Portuguese company. And only, I think now we have 4 large companies that entered into licenses. And when I say small companies, I mean under 500 employees. We did notice a trend that foreign companies tended to be larger. And many of the foreign licensees had over 100 employees, 100, 200, 300, 400 employees. These are still considered small entities by US standards, but they were certainly larger than the typical US licensee. The typical US licensee was probably in the order of 20 to 100 employees, I would say. And the foreign licensees were much more likely to be on the order of 200 employees or larger. And so looking ahead, JPL, of course, is a space mission directed organization. So we're winding down our efforts in designing and developing the Vital Ventilator and concentrating our efforts more on supporting licensees, of course, passing the baton to licensees for manufacturing, commercialization, and utilization. And based on levels of support that we're seeing, several licensees in the US, Brazil, and India in particular are very aggressively developing the ventilator. So one of the things you worry about is you do this tremendous effort, and then you license it to companies, and the company, it's a free market. They don't have to do anything, but they do what's best for their business. And so one big concern was that these companies would realize, well, perhaps there's just not the market for this that we thought. It's more complex to develop this than we thought. But it's turning out that we do have several licensees that are really aggressively moving ahead with this. One of these companies that in particular that I really like is a company in Brazil, Russell Brazil, they required electromagnetic compatibility test to obtain the Brazilian Health Regulatory Authority. It's called Anvisa registration. And the FDA actually waived this requirement for the EUA. They didn't feel that for an emergency use, this electromagnetic compatibility was all that important. So for Russell Brazil, JPL agreed to perform the test so that they could achieve their Anvisa registration, and they could continue to move aggressively on this. And we are expecting a ramping up of manufacturing and sales of Vital. We're thinking that we might even have the first sale by the end of 2020, but certainly by the first quarter. And so that's pretty much the story. Just wanted to thank you. I'm, as Bruce mentioned, I'm the manager of the Office of Technology Transfer at JPL. And we have an office at JPL and a part of the Office of Technology Transfer and Corporate Partnerships at Caltech as well. And I've had my feet in both places. And happy to take any questions at this point.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and if any of the rest of you want to ask questions, you can just raise your hand. But one question that we have is, I guess, how many of these have been made? Have any of them been manufactured yet, or we're hoping for Q1 for that? Or
yeah, we're hoping for, I would say the earliest that's going to happen. I think we'll probably see some prototypes in the next month, most likely. But in terms of devices that can actually be sold, I would say probably the end of the calendar year and probably first quarter of 2021 is when we're expecting actual devices to be sold and utilized.
And has JPL ever done a public-facing project like this before for this kind of emergency, or?
I cannot think of any. I've only been here at Caltech for 12 years, but this is the only time I can think of, doing, something quite like this.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Eric.
Yes, thank you. Could you share a little bit about the intellectual property? What was novel in the product design, please?
Mainly the blowers. In order to make it compact, we have some air mixing devices that are 3D printed, and these were very new. In fact, we have two general patent applications that we filed. One is for the system as a whole. We do think that there are system level claims in our patent that are quite patentable, and but for the air mixing devices, we feel these in themselves are patentable devices. And we filed a separate application on them because we feel that they're applicable not only to the ventilator, but they might be applicable to other devices as well, other industrial devices. So we'll see what happens with that.
So one of the folks in the chat asked, did you say that your large licensee was Dassault? Dassault? What's the name of the large U.S. licensee?
Oh, no, the large U.S. licensee is Espina, which is actually a U.S. subsidiary of a Japanese company.
Oh, okay.
But when you look at the entire company, it would be considered a large entity, at least. Or when you file patents, you have to pay either small entity fees, which we can do because we're a nonprofit, or if you are licensing it or providing rights to anybody with over 500 employees, you'll need to pay large entity fees. And because Espina is part of a large entity, we are going to have to pay large entity fees. And as I mentioned, we do have 3 large entities, over 500 employees for our foreign licensees.
So another asked, what is the estimated cost and how does this compare to existing solutions?
Yeah, so we a little bit mum on the cost. As I said, it has 1/7 of the parts of a normal ventilator. Because it has 1/7 of the parts, it can be assembled much more quickly as well. And the parts are not in the normal ventilator supply chain. So, you know, we are throwing around figures of a couple $1,000s to make this, but I think the problem with numbers like that is it depends on volume. If you've ever done manufacturing, you're very aware that if you're making 10 per year, your parts cost, you're paying one thing for parts. If you're selling 1 million per year, your part cost is very, very different at orders of magnitude in many cases. You know, it really depends on the volume.
So I have a question that's kind of maybe off the wall, but are you utilizing blockchain technology in any of your chain of custody or materials management or data management in this process?
We are not, but our licensees might.
Mm.
We didn't feel the need to use, you know, that level of sophistication. But yeah, I mean, our licensees might, though. Yeah, sure.
I have a question. What agency was involved in this? Somebody funded it, I presume. So what agency or agencies do we have to thank for helping make this a possibility?
Yeah, well, NASA funded it, and I would say the funds came out of a discretionary account that JPL, that Caltech had. So basically, when NASA funds the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is managed by Caltech. And part of the funding, you know, relatively small percentage-wise, but actually not a bad number, is discretionary funds. So that, and these discretionary funds can be used on a variety of projects. They're not entirely discretionary. There has to be a NASA benefit to them, of course, or there has to be, you know, a public benefit. And so, you know, we did get NASA on board with this. And, you know, we needed to get NASA on board not only because we were using these funds, but because NASA we needed all kinds of approvals from NASA as well. We needed, whenever we put out a press release or put out a public document that had the NASA logo on it, they needed to approve it. We also needed export control to, you know, take a look at this as quickly as possible and provide us answers as quickly as possible. And we need to send the prototypes to the licensees as well. And NASA is not crazy about taking fully developed equipment off the lab and sending it off site. It requires you know, quite a bit of paperwork to do that, but because of this, the high priority of this, NASA is really you know, allowing us to acting very rapidly in terms of our request to do this.
Speaking of public relations, I mean, this has to be sort of a PR win, I would imagine, for JPL. And one of our folks is asking if any of the Justine is asking, can the technology be traced directly to any innovations from JPL's space work?
Well, I would say certainly some of the capabilities can be traced. For example, I've never been on a Tiger team before, and I've never, you know, been a part of that or seen it work. And you know, now I can see how JPL is so successful, you know, in terms of getting some of these projects, and in terms of seeing, you know, seeing the things that they do. I mean, it was amazing how so many different people from all kinds of places at JPL could just come together and do their thing. And it was extraordinary. So I think really the human capital was the most important form of capital here. And, you know, human capital is the most important form of capital.
So along those lines, what was the biggest hurdle for you in the entire process, as Chris asked that?
I think the biggest hurdle was really trying to come up, for me, because I was on the IP and licensing side, was first of all coming up with an intellectual property strategy and a licensing strategy very quickly that would work for everybody. You know, this is going to work for all the U.S. licensees. It's going to work for all the international licensees, and we're not going to get a lot of pushback on our licenses because we don't have time for it.
Right.
And also coming up with an intellectual property strategy such that it it could possibly pay off in the future, so that we can provide the technology for the emergency use authorization, and then have options down the road. And this had to be done, really quickly. And as I mentioned, when people act cooperatively and you've got really good people on the project, I was very fortunate to work with a really highly intelligent lady from the Office of General Counsel, who was just extremely helpful in helping with the licensing and the intellectual property, and some of the other legal aspects of it. So that just having good, cooperative, responsive people hugely helpful. Yeah.
So John asks that you mentioned that this could work in a non-hospital situation, and India seems to be approaching a crisis. Could this be used in India's healthcare system?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's the whole idea. We have several Indian licensees. In fact, we have 4 Indian licensees, and we're now interviewing a 5th one. And we have on that interviewing panel, we have somebody from India, engineer from India that's on the panel, that's able to get some insights into the capabilities of this company. And yeah, the whole idea of the compressor design is that you don't need to use it in a hospital. You can use this in a makeshift setting, in a tent or a mobile platform, or those kinds of things. So it's very so the Indians have been very interested in this.
So Randy asks if there's a consumable or sterilizing requirement, for example, on the exhalation side.
No, there is, but it lasts for 20 days, and then you do replace certain components, and then you can keep using it. And so for about, I think I said 4 months. So, but there are some consumables on there that do have to be replaced after 20 days, after 20 days of use.
So you obviously gave a great presentation, because there's a lot of questions here. So Brian asks, what level of tooling sophistication is required for the manufacturing?
Fortunately, not very much tooling. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing that we were asking our licensees in terms of their capabilities, their ability to do this. 2 things: do you have 3D printing capabilities? And nowadays, that's a pretty common capability. 10 years ago, it might not have been, but certainly 20 years ago, it probably wasn't. But in 2020, we would ask this question to the Indian companies and the Brazilian companies, and yeah, they had it. And it's really a real worldwide capability now. The other thing that we needed was software capabilities, because the software. The FDA emergency use authorization said, this software is good for demonstration software, but the software will have to be developed, further for an actual commercial device to be used. And so that was a big question for our licensees as well.
Is there a IoT or connected aspect of the system? And if so, how did security play into that issue of the software?
Yeah, so right now we don't have an IoT aspect, but the licensees can certainly build one in without too much trouble. So it's really, that was something that we allowed to be productized, by the licensees.
Mm-hmm. But should they choose to make it a connected device, then I imagine they'll have to explore all of the
HIPAA,
security regulations that go along with that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and we've had to deal with that. Caltech deals with that in some of its research, and JPL actually deals with that in some of its research as well. How do you de-identify data and make sure that it's de-identified so that somebody can't hack into it?
Or how do you keep somebody from controlling somebody else's ventilator? I know there was a very famous case not that long ago with a white hat hack into a ventilator system in a hospital. So
yeah, and this is designed to be locally operated. It is right now it does not have the capability to be remotely operated. or, but you could, you could certainly productize it if
Mhm.
you wanted to.
So John asks, this was all done when JPL was in level 3 and then level 4 shutdown. So how much was handled virtually?
That's a good question. So we did have people in labs that were putting together this device and testing it. And so I would say probably a third of the folks were actually on lab and about 2/3 were virtual. People on the project had pretty sophisticated home offices, I have to say. Some of them did anyway.
Yeah, that's what happens when you have a bunch of sciencey people. They tend to have pretty good setups at home. Chris asks, we talked a little bit about what the cost of the end product would be, but what about the estimated development cost? I mean, what kinds of costs are these companies looking at taking on for something like that? Do you have any estimates?
Yeah, I mean, I used to do these budgets when I worked at Motorola and Rockwell, and it's hard to say. I haven't done these kind of budgets in a while. It's really up to each individual company to do their own budget. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to cost a few $100,000 to do this. I would, if I were to budget it, I'd probably budget $1 million. Because you have to write the software, you have to. By the time you really, you go from point A to the point where you can commercialize it. If I were a U.S. company, I would certainly budget.
A related question to that is there's no grant back requirement. So if you have 27 licensees, you could have 27 versions of this ventilator start to develop or not.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a good question. I didn't put that in my presentation, but we do have a term in the license where if the licensees develop something that is it's reasonably expected to result in decreased morbidity or mortality, they are required to share that with the other licensees. And we're actually putting a platform on for licensees to communicate with each other. If they want to, it's voluntary. But given the fact that we've done very limited testing in humans, we did want to put that in, that there's a grant back to Caltech, who can then grant this to other licensees. So of course, this doesn't, people had all kinds of questions about this term of the license. They said, well, if we're using our particular printed circuit board, do we have to share that with the licensees? Of course not. That's something that's particular to the company, and that's a productization decision by the company. Similarly, if a company were to want to increase the lifetime of the product, beyond the 4 months, and add components that don't need to be replaced as often, they would have to go to the FDA and get that approved. But they could certainly do that, and that would not be something that would be a business decision. So we don't want to take business productization decisions by the licensees and say, you have to share that with everybody. But if they really find something that says, oh, this decreases mortality, tremendously, yeah, we are requiring them to share that.
So before we head off for our happy hour, Billy's putting a shout out for the magic word 3D technology. He says Micro Consultants has all the solutions you need in 3D technology. So that's from Billy. And I want to thank you. This has really been a fascinating presentation, and there's so many good questions. So
one more question is how you don't have a local like San Gabriel Valley licensee. Did you get interest from local companies, and is there a way, if not, is there a way to get the word out on the street more so that happens next time there's a project like this, which may never happen, but.
Well, San Gabriel is, we did get 3 Southern California licensees. One was in Ventura, the other was in
Irvine, I saw listed.
Irvine, and also in Los Angeles. So we got 3 Southern California licensees. We're pretty happy about that, actually. Southern California licensees, so we've got one in Northern California too. But
thank you. So I'm gonna pass the baton back to Bruce. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jeanette and Brenda and Brian. and everybody else for joining us. Very interesting and inspiring, and good to hear that such good work is being done locally. And I'm sad that it's going to take till the first quarter of next year. Hopefully, maybe someone will have a breakthrough moment and accelerate that time frame.
No, I think by the end of the calendar year, I'm expecting about 3 or 4 of these companies to actually be selling products and utilizing products.
Yeah.
And that's my guess. I hope so. But by the first quarter, for sure.
Yeah, I think sadly we're going to need them. Brazil sounds like they really need them, in India as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So, okay, so again, thanks everybody for joining us, and we're going to take a 5-minute break as suggested to go to our virtual. Jeanette already has her refreshment with her. So you guys are more than welcome to hang out and come back, and we'll continue this more informally. So again, thanks for joining us. Thank you, Dan.
Hey, you're welcome.